name is Mary Wachacha. I was born here on the Kuala Boundary on September the 30th, 1948. I am 71 years old. I have not lived here all of my life, but I lived here until I went away to boarding school as a sophomore in high school. And eventually, I never really came back after I went away to boarding school and went on to college and joined the Peace Corps. And when my tour of duty was up, I came back, and by that time I was about 23 or 24, and I became a teacher in the Cherokee school system, and then moved to the Indian Health Service, from which I retired about 8 years ago. Well, I left when I was a sophomore and went to Riverside Indian School in Anadarko, Oklahoma. And then after that first year at boarding school, and I wanted to go to boarding school, and my mom and dad had come to visit during the time I was a sophomore at the Riverside Indian School. And after that visit, when the summertime came and I came home, my dad said I could not go back there. He felt like the school was too wild. So I still wanted to go away to boarding school, so I was accepted at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And that's where I graduated from in 1966. And then after I graduated from high school, I went to college in Kansas, and eventually came back to go to Western for a short while. And as soon as I graduated there, I joined the Peace Corps, and I was gone for 3 or 4 years. And so that's what I mean, I never really came back. Oh, I loved it. I had a great time. You have to remember that when I was 14 years old and a sophomore in high school, Cherokee was just a sleepy little town. There was absolutely nothing here to do. And the only thing to do really was go to church. And churches were really big in people's lives here. And that's because most people lived close enough to a church that they could actually walk to it, as my family did. And all my friends, or not all, but a lot of my friends were there. So it was a good socializing influence. So I was eager to get away, and when I got to boarding school, it was such a change, because if you behaved throughout the week, and if you had money, you could go into town, Anadarko, and a bus would take the students in, and you could kind of wander the streets of Anadarko for about 30 minutes to an hour. And then again, if you had the money, you could go to the movie at the theater. And so, of course, here in Cherokee, we had no theaters, and you had to go to Silver or Bryson City. But in my family, we used to go to the drive-in movies, where you actually drive in your car, and everybody's in the car, and you watch the movie on a big screen. There was clubs to join after school, and we went back to the dormitories. In my case, I lived in the cottage on the campus there, and you just got to see your friends all day long, really, and you don't get that when you're at home. So I really enjoyed boarding school, both at Riverside and at Santa Fe, and that's kind of why I was eager to get away. The boarding schools here on the Kuala Boundary, I think they first opened around the 18 late 1880s. And it was called the Cherokee Training School. And it was to train Cherokee Indian students in different vocations. So they lived on campus, and as one person that I knew stated, one elder said, well, we had a warm place to sleep and a warm place to go to school. We had a nice clean bed to crawl into. I didn't have to put my feet down on an old dirt floor. There was actually windows in the window. We had food and meals 3 times a day, and I thought it was wonderful. And I've just described how I went off to boarding school, although not here in Cherokee, but I thought it was wonderful. But for as many wonderful tales as there are many elders. A good many of them have passed away now, here in 2020. But a lot of elders would tell a different story of a very sad time in the boarding schools. And they were very harsh conditions, especially for young children. My grandmother was born in 1891. One of my grandmothers was born in 1891. And she went to the boarding school. My other grandmother went as well. But my Grandma Smith is one of those that, they say, get a lemon and make lemonade. She never saw anything sour about the world. My other grandmother is Lula Al Glowin. Just sort of grew up in the boarding school. She said there were many things that she was thankful for, but she had many sad memories of going to school there. She said her worst memory was, she said she was about 9 or 10 years old. She spoke Cherokee, but she also spoke good English. And she was at the boarding school one day, and she said she went into the bathroom, and the matron was telling one of the young girls that she needed to remove the soap from behind her ears. She hadn't rinsed her hair very well. So Grandma said the young girl couldn't understand what the matron was saying. And so Grandma said, she's telling you to wash behind your ears better. And she said it in English. And the matron immediately got irate. She grabbed my grandmother by the shoulder. She pulled her down the hallway. She opened the door to the attic. She took her up in the attic and deposited her there and told her she could think about how she was not supposed to be speaking Cherokee. And she went back down the stairs and shut and locked the door. So there was my grandmother, 8 or 10 years old, in that attic by herself. And she said that at first she was able to amuse herself in the daylight. And there were windows. And she said some of the matrons had left trunks up there. And there was old clothes in them and old shoes and the button-up shoes. And my grandmother said I had fun digging in those trunks. But she said toward evening I'm starting to get hungry. And I go down and I'm pounding on the door, hollering for the matron, and she said, of course, no one came. She said when we were in the dormitory, we would hear noises coming from the attic, and it scared all of us. She said unless you had been put in the attic, we didn't know that it was just other students up there wanting to get out. She said, well, the matron never came back and got me, so I stayed up there all night long. And she said, I was so scared and so afraid of the dark. And she said, and to this day, I'm somewhat afraid of the dark. And the entire time I knew my grandmother, if she left the house, she always left the light on in the house. She did not believe in walking into a dark house. So that was one of her hangovers from one of the boarding school days. The next day, because there were windows in the attic, she said she looked down and she saw her dad riding up on horseback. Now, her dad and mom, their house was not that far from the boarding school. If you lived close enough to the boarding school and the parents had proven that they would bring you back, you could go home for the weekend. So he had come to pick her up to take her back home for the weekend. And she said she saw one of the matrons out there talking to her dad on the horse. And she said she was beating on that window, trying to get their attention, but they didn't get her attention. And she said in a few minutes, here come that matron up that had locked her up there. And she unlocked her and she opened the door, and Grandma was standing there, and she hugged her and she apologized, and she said, "Please don't tell your daddy that I left you up here all night long. I'm so sorry, I forgot all about you." And my grandma said, "But when I saw my daddy, that was the first thing I told him." She said, "But after that, I felt such fear for speaking Cherokee that I never really spoke it again, because I was afraid to speak it." So that is one bad incident. But at the same time, my grandmother would tell you that her parents were great believers in education, and her dad having gone to school at Trinity and her mother gone to the boarding school, wanted their children to become teachers in the school to teach the Indian kids. And so they always encouraged them to study and learn. Once she and 4 or 5 girls ran away, and again because she lived so close to where the home place was, when she got there, her dad was out on the porch, and he looked up in surprise, and he asked her what she was doing there, and she told him that she'd run away from school. And he said, "You're not running away from school." And he said, "You start on back down that trail and go back to school. I put you there and you're going to stay there and learn." And she said so she had to walk all the way back to the school. And she said, "But when I got back, they hadn't even missed me. They didn't even know that I was gone." So there's lots of good stories and bad stories about the boarding school. I would say from 1900 till the 1920s, 25 maybe, for sure the boarding school tried to eradicate the children from speaking the language in the school. And most people will tell you that they just quit talking Cherokee when they got to the boarding school. My husband is a fluent speaker, and he grew up in the snowbird community, and he went to snowbird day school. And they had fabulous teachers, this husband and wife team, Mr. and Mrs. Lee. And they had to speak English in school. And occasionally they slipped up, and they might have spoken Cherokee in the classroom. But my husband said they weren't punished. They were just told, we speak English here. And he said, but then when they got out on the playground, they all spoke Cherokee among themselves, and said the teachers never stopped them. And so they had a very pleasant experience at a day school. It was not a boarding school. I think it's important, but I don't think it's something to dwell on. As a former teacher myself, Cherokees had very bitter experiences in the boarding school days. There are many, many, many stories out there of harsh things that were done to kids. There's the story of one boy from Big Cove who he kept running away, and finally they chained him to the bedstead. And somehow he managed to take away the bed, and he managed to run away from the boarding school carrying the bedstead end that he was chained to, carrying it with him, and they caught him somewhere going back up towards Big Cove, dragging and carrying that bedstead that was chained to his ankle or something. There's other stories of students being whipped and students being punished. So, consequently, a lot of students did not want to go to school because they associated education with harsh treatment. And so they didn't want their kids to go to school. And that manifested itself all the way up until when I first started teaching here in 1975 at the elementary school. No matter what crazy story a student would go home and tell mom and dad, even though it could not have possibly happened that way, irate parents would come to the school and they would be ready to jump on the teacher because they believed the student over the teacher, because they knew how harsh they and their parents had been treated. And so it was just natural to assume that whatever their student said had happened, then it really happened. And that is a really hard environment to try to make changes. And education at Cherokee has gotten much, much better. I don't know that we can attribute very much of that to the establishment of those early boarding schools, because they were so harsh with the students, and that legacy lives on. Whereas you have at Snowbird, and the students that were at Snowbird Day School during the time of the Lees speak of a wonderful experience of being in a boarding school, and they have fond memories of going to school. And I don't think we can forget about the boarding schools, but we just have to remember there were some good experiences that came out of there, and some good teachers and some good students. And I think the tribe today is moving forward with a lot and lots of educated people. But I think we could have done without the boarding schools altogether. I think our students need to be aware of the past, but they also need to be taught to look at today and what are you going to do tomorrow. So the children have to really decide what their legacy is going to be and how they're going to raise their children and what do they think of education, because that's the key to success.